Welcome to The Boring Historian. Tonight, we'll explore why Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, was a living nightmare for the soldiers who endured it. This story isn't about the glory of battles, but the exhaustion, the hunger, the mud, and the endless nights that made this one of the harshest campaigns in human history. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to The Boring Historian for more calm history made to help you relax and drift into sleep. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, let's begin our story. The morning of June 22, 1941, began quietly for many. In the grey light just before dawn, Soviet border guards were rising from rough bunks, rubbing their eyes, and preparing for another day of uneventful patrol. For weeks, there had been rumors that Germany might break the uneasy pact signed just 2 years earlier. But rumors were easy to dismiss. On that summer morning, the grass was still wet with dew, the air was warm, and there was no reason to think the world was about to collapse. Then, at around 4 a.m., the horizon lit up. Without warning, the roar of artillery shattered the silence. Thousands of German guns opened fire across an 800-mile front. Shells screamed overhead and landed with devastating force in Soviet positions. Wooden watchtowers splintered, barracks collapsed, and men who had been sipping their first tin mugs of tea were thrown into the dirt by the blasts. For many soldiers, there was no gradual build-up to war. One moment they were squinting into the early light, the next they were choking on smoke and dust, trying to understand what had happened. German soldiers, too, felt the enormity of the moment. For weeks, they had camped just behind the border, enduring secrecy, boredom, and nervous anticipation. Many had been told that they were about to embark on a campaign that would last only a few months, maybe even just weeks. Some believed the propaganda that painted the Soviet Union as weak and disorganized, a state that would collapse with a single push. Yet, even for them, the sudden thunder of guns at dawn was overwhelming. The earth trembled under their boots. The skies, once pale with sunrise, were now streaked with smoke and fire. Airplanes joined in within minutes. The Luftwaffe had prepared carefully, and as Soviet troops scrambled to understand the situation, German bombers screamed across the sky, striking airfields and railways. Entire rows of Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground before they had a chance to lift off. Pilots were caught in their beds or, while still dressing, running half-prepared toward machines that were already engulfed in flames. The invasion, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, had begun not with a gradual escalation, but with a crushing blow meant to shock, terrify, and overwhelm. For Soviet soldiers on the ground, disbelief was the first reaction. Some thought it was a mistake, perhaps even an accident. Others assumed the Germans were acting without orders, a rogue provocation that would soon be explained. But as the shells kept falling, and as wave after wave of enemy planes strafed trenches and supply depots, there could be no doubt Germany had broken the pact. The largest invasion in history was underway. German infantry, waiting just behind the artillery barrage, began to move. Columns stretched for miles, with trucks, horses, bicycles, and tanks all pouring across the border. Dust rose in thick clouds as boots pounded the earth. The Wehrmacht had planned for speed. Divisions were instructed to push forward as far and as fast as possible, surrounding enemy units before they could properly regroup. For the young men marching in neat lines, it felt like the beginning of something unstoppable. But many also felt unease. They had crossed into another world, a vast unknown land stretching endlessly eastward, a land they had been told was primitive, but whose size alone was intimidating. On the Soviet side, chaos reigned. Communication lines were shattered within the first hours. Commanders at the front sent desperate telegrams back to Moscow, but wires were cut, radios jammed, and many messages never arrived. Units acted in isolation, some holding their ground heroically, others falling back in confusion. Whole regiments dissolved into panic as German panzers appeared suddenly on the horizon. In towns near the frontier, civilians woke to find their homes shaking with explosions. Mothers clutched children and fled down dusty roads, not knowing where safety lay. The sound of boots and engines thundered behind them, growing louder. For individual soldiers, the memory of that morning stayed sharp for years. Some remembered the smell of burning oil as depots went up in flames. Others recalled the eerie whistling of bombs just before they struck. Many remembered the sheer disorientation, the way the sunrise, usually a sign of warmth and routine, was drowned out by fire and noise. Time seemed to collapse into a blur of shouting, running, choking, and the ever-present thud of shells. By mid-morning, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Entire Soviet divisions were crumbling. German troops were advancing rapidly, seizing bridges, capturing towns, and pushing deep into the countryside. Yet, even as their advance gained momentum, soldiers on both sides knew the nightmare was only beginning. For the Germans there was the exhilaration of forward motion, but also the weight of miles still ahead. For the Soviets there was terror, but also the first sparks of stubborn resistance that would grow fiercer with each passing week. The morning of June 22, 1941, was not just the beginning of a military campaign. It was the start of a human ordeal that would claim millions of lives and scar the memories of survivors forever. Soldiers who lived through that dawn would recall it as a moment when the world seemed to split in two, before and after. Before, there was unease, but also routine. After, there was only fire, fear, and the long road into the nightmare of Operation Barbarossa. After the thunder of that first morning, the days that followed for German soldiers were filled not with quick victories, but with miles upon miles of dust, sweat, and exhaustion. The invasion had been planned with breathtaking ambition. 3 massive army groups were to plunge deep into Soviet territory, covering hundreds of miles in just a matter of weeks. On maps, the arrows drawn across the paper looked simple, neat, and almost effortless. On the ground, however, the advance was anything but. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the reality of war quickly became the endless march eastward. After the artillery and airplanes had done their work, after the tanks had thundered ahead, it fell to the ordinary infantrymen to move forward, often on foot, carrying heavy packs across roads that seemed to stretch into eternity. The summer sun beat down relentlessly. It was June, and the farther east they went, the hotter the days seemed to grow. Dust clung to their uniforms, mixed with sweat and coated throats until every breath was gritty. Canteens emptied quickly, and refilling them was not always possible. Wells were few, rivers not always clean, and stopping for water meant slowing the relentless pace of the march. Each day followed a rhythm of exhaustion. Columns began moving before dawn when the air was still cool and the sky pale with the first light. Boots struck the dirt roads in unison, the crunch of gravel and the dull clink of mess tins rattling against packs, creating a strange, monotonous music. At first, soldiers tried to talk, sharing jokes or humming songs, but after hours under the sun, conversation faded into silence. Men kept their heads down, eyes fixed on the boots of the soldier ahead, forcing one step after another. By midday, uniforms were soaked with sweat, straps cut into shoulders, and feet burned inside stiff leather boots that never seemed to fit quite right. Blisters formed, burst, and bled. Yet the march continued, because stopping was never truly an option. Dust became one of the most despised enemies of the campaign. As thousands of boots and hundreds of vehicles moved along the same roads, thick clouds rose into the air and hung there, suspended in the heat. Breathing became difficult. Eyes stung and watered. Every mouthful of bread tasted of dirt. Soldiers tied handkerchiefs around their mouths or pulled caps low over their faces, but it did little good. Some wrote later that they felt as if they were marching inside a sandstorm that followed them everywhere. Tanks and trucks, meant to symbolize speed and power, often broke down or clogged the roads, leaving infantrymen to stumble through choking clouds of exhaust and dust kicked up by machines too slow or too overloaded to move efficiently. The distances were staggering. Within just a few weeks, some German units had advanced hundreds of miles. The speed of the advance was unlike anything most soldiers had ever experienced. But the human body was not made for such relentless motion. Sleep was scarce. At night, men collapsed into ditches or fields, too tired to eat properly, too drained even to unlace their boots. They would sleep in filthy uniforms, heads resting on their packs, and rise again before dawn to keep marching. Small injuries, a cut, a twisted ankle, an untreated blister, became serious problems when there was no chance to rest. Yet discipline demanded that the pace be kept, no matter the pain. Hunger added to the misery. Rations had been planned, but supply wagons often lagged behind the rapid advance. Soldiers carried hard bread, tins of meat, or dried sausages, but these ran out quickly. Many began to rely on whatever they could find along the way. Fields of grain were plundered, barns raided, and livestock taken. To the soldiers, it was survival. To the civilians who watched their food vanish, it was devastation. The further east the army moved, the more barren the countryside became. Long stretches of open land meant days with little to eat beyond dry bread and weak soup, if even that. The psychological toll of the march was heavy. At first there had been excitement, the belief that they were part of a historic campaign, destined to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. But as the days blurred into one another, excitement gave way to weariness. For every village captured, there was another to march toward. For every river crossed, another one loomed ahead. The Soviet Union seemed endless, stretching beyond the horizon, and the promise of a quick war began to feel less certain. On the Soviet side, retreating soldiers and civilians watched the dust clouds rise on the horizon and knew what they meant. For them, the German advance looked unstoppable, a tide of men and machines that swallowed everything in its path. Yet even as they fled, some began to dig trenches, to sabotage bridges, to prepare ambushes in forests and towns. The endless march east was not unopposed. Snipers, mines, and sudden bursts of resistance reminded German soldiers that the enemy was still there, waiting and watching. By the end of each day, men staggered into makeshift camps, too exhausted to speak. Horses collapsed in harnesses, drivers dozed at the wheels of trucks, and infantrymen dropped wherever they could find space. The dream of victory still lingered, but it was overshadowed by the reality of blistered feet, parched throats, and the endless road stretching farther and farther into the Soviet heartland. The march east was supposed to symbolize power and triumph, but for the ordinary soldier, it became a monotonous, grinding ordeal, a reminder that war was not only fought in battles, but also in every painful step taken across a land that seemed to have no end. As the long columns of German troops pressed eastward, a quiet unease began to spread among the men. For days, the advance had seemed like a one-sided march, a crushing sweep that pushed deeper and deeper into Soviet lands. Villages fell, bridges were captured, and miles were covered. But soon, the soldiers would learn that the Soviet Union, vast and wounded, was not going to collapse quite so easily. Their first encounters with real resistance would shake the illusion of an effortless campaign and remind them that war was never as simple as the lines drawn on a map. The first signs came suddenly, often without warning. A dusty road through farmland seemed empty, only for gunfire to erupt from a tree line. Hidden machine guns spat bursts that tore into the marching columns, and the air filled with shouting, confusion, and the sharp crack of rifles. For many German soldiers, this was their first taste of Soviet determination. They had been told that the Red Army would scatter, that poorly trained soldiers would drop their weapons and surrender. Instead, they found themselves pinned down in fields, their ears ringing with the whine of bullets, crawling through dirt to find cover while smoke drifted across the landscape. Ambushes became a constant threat. Soviet troops, though disorganized in the first days of the invasion, used the land to their advantage. They struck at bridges, mined roads, and used forests as natural fortresses. German trucks rumbled confidently across wooden crossings, only for the timbers to explode beneath them, sending men and supplies crashing into rivers. Columns that had marched for hours under the blazing sun were suddenly scattered by grenades thrown from ditches or barns. Each step forward seemed to invite danger, and each bend in the road carried the possibility of hidden eyes waiting in silence. The battles that followed were often chaotic. German soldiers, accustomed to clear orders and disciplined movements, found themselves fighting in confusion, smoke swirling around them, visibility reduced to a few meters. Tanks roared ahead, crushing fences and tearing through villages. But even they were vulnerable to the close-range attacks of determined Soviet soldiers. Molotov cocktails, simple bottles filled with fuel and lit with rags, were hurled at armored vehicles, engulfing them in sudden flames. Crews scrambled out of hatches, their uniforms burning, as cheers rose from defenders who seemed to appear from nowhere. For the infantrymen advancing behind the panzers, the experience was unnerving. The smell of burning fuel mixed with gunpowder and dust, creating a choking haze that hung over the fields. Shouting was drowned out by the pounding of artillery, the whoosh of shells flying overhead, and the sickening thud as they landed. In moments like these, the neat lines of soldiers disintegrated. Men hugged the earth, firing blindly toward flashes in the smoke, ears ringing from explosions so close they rattled the bones. Some froze, unable to move forward, clutching rifles slick with sweat, while officers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to restore order. The Soviet defenders fought with a desperation born of survival. Many had little training, some had barely enough ammunition, and yet they resisted with ferocity. Stories spread among German troops of Soviet soldiers fighting to the last bullet, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Whole platoons were wiped out rather than raising a white flag. German propaganda had promised an easy victory, but the reality on the ground was far different. This was a fight to the death. and their enemy was not willing to give ground without exacting a terrible price. For civilians caught in the middle, the scenes were terrifying. Villages became battlefields in an instant. One moment a farmer was tending to livestock. The next, his home was shattered by shells, his barn set ablaze, his family fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Smoke rose from wooden rooftops, drifting across the countryside, and the smell of scorched earth lingered long after the shooting stopped. For German soldiers trudging past the blackened ruins, it was a haunting sight, evidence that this war was not clean or swift, but brutal and consuming. In these first clashes, the myth of a quick campaign began to fray. German troops were forced to slow their advance, to clear forests inch by inch, to rebuild bridges that had been destroyed overnight. Losses mounted. Comrades who had marched beside them only days earlier were now lying silent in the grass, covered hastily with blankets or left where they had fallen. The war was no longer a distant idea. It was a smoke-filled chaos where death could come at any moment, and the enemy was far stronger and more stubborn than anyone had admitted. By the end of these first encounters, a grim realization was settling in among the ranks. Yes, they were advancing. Yes, towns and villages were falling. But each step forward was bought with blood, sweat, and nerves stretched to breaking point. The Soviet Union was not collapsing, it was resisting, and with each day, the resistance grew fiercer. For soldiers on both sides, the unnerving reality of war was now unavoidable. This was not going to be quick, and it was not going to be clean. The endless march east had turned into something far more frightening. It was no longer just dust, blisters, and exhaustion. It was smoke, ambushes, burning tanks, and the unsettling truth that the nightmare of Operation Barbarossa was only just beginning. Beyond the battles and bursts of chaos, much of Operation Barbarossa was spent in the monotonous grind of movement. For the ordinary German soldier, life inside the columns of the Wehrmacht was a blur of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. The campaign was designed to move quickly, with speed as its greatest weapon. But speed meant sacrifice. Comfort, rest, and nourishment were luxuries that the men rarely saw. The daily routine began long before dawn. Officers would rouse the men while the stars still shimmered faintly in the eastern sky. Orders were shouted, packs slung over sore shoulders, and boots tightened around blistered feet. Horses were hitched to wagons, tanks rumbled to life, and trucks coughed up clouds of exhaust. Then, almost as soon as the first light touched the horizon, the march began. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was hurried and meager. A scrap of bread pulled from a pocket, perhaps dipped into weak coffee brewed hastily in tin cups over small fires. If there was time, some soldiers chewed on dry crackers that crumbled into dust inside their mouths, washing them down with the last sips of water left in their canteens. Hot meals were rare. The field kitchens, lumbering along behind the columns, often struggled to keep up. Men who had been promised hearty stews and steaming bowls of soup instead learned to live on whatever they could carry in their packs. A piece of sausage hardened with age, a tin of meat spread eaten cold, or nothing at all. Water was even more precious. The heat of the summer campaign made thirst a constant companion. Canteens were drained quickly, and rivers or wells along the way became treasured finds. Soldiers would cluster around them, scooping muddy water with helmets or filling bottles despite warnings of contamination. Dysentery spread quietly among the ranks, the result of desperate gulps from unclean sources. But the risk of illness seemed small compared to the gnawing burn of thirst on a march that never seemed to end. The pace itself was punishing. Hours of marching under the sun wore down even the fittest soldiers. Boots rubbed raw skin into open sores, and many men stuffed rags into their footwear, hoping to ease the pain. Shoulders ached from the weight of rifles, ammunition pouches, and heavy packs that dug into flesh. Sweat soaked uniforms until they clung like a second skin, stiffening with salt as they dried. By midday, soldiers moved like ghosts through the haze of heat and dust, their eyes glassy with fatigue, minds dulled to the monotony of one foot in front of the other. Sleep was fleeting and restless. At night, after miles of marching, men would collapse onto the bare ground, using helmets or packs as pillows. Some did not bother to unlace their boots, too tired to risk losing precious minutes of rest. Fires were sometimes forbidden to avoid drawing enemy attention, so the darkness was broken only by the occasional flicker of a cigarette or the dim glow of the moon. The sleep that came was shallow, easily broken by the rumble of distant artillery or the bark of an officer's command. When dawn arrived, the men rose stiff and sore, shaking off fatigue as best they could before setting out again. Inside the columns, the atmosphere shifted between moments of quiet camaraderie and tense silence. Soldiers shared stories, jokes, and songs when spirits were high, their laughter carrying faintly over the rhythm of boots striking dirt. But exhaustion quickly smothered such moments. Long stretches of road were covered in near silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel, the squeak of wagon wheels, and the occasional groan of a horse pulling too heavy a load. Time itself seemed to stretch, the horizon always far away, the road always endless. There was also the constant reminder of vulnerability. Every soldier knew that the neat lines of the columns could, at any moment, be torn apart by an ambush or an air raid. The memory of sudden Soviet attacks lingered, and each shadowy grove of trees, each bend in the road, seemed like a potential trap. The columns pressed on regardless, but tension gnawed at nerves. A bird taking flight might draw uneasy glances, a sudden noise in the distance could send hands tightening on rifles. Even within the supposed order of the Wehrmacht, chaos was never far away. Vehicles broke down constantly, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and men straggled behind despite the harsh punishments for falling out of line. The pace of the campaign demanded efficiency, but reality was always messier. Officers barked commands, urging the columns forward, while behind them lay trails of discarded gear, broken carts, and the bodies of those who could not keep up. Despite the misery, soldiers clung to routines that gave them some sense of stability. They cleaned rifles when they could, polished boots out of habit, or wrote letters home in the brief moments of rest, describing the march in words that rarely captured the true grind of it. In their letters they often spoke of villages captured, of victories won, of comrades marching beside them. Few wrote honestly about the exhaustion that hollowed out their faces, or the way every muscle ached, or how the thought of another endless day on the road filled them with quiet dread. Life inside the Wehrmacht columns was not marked by grand battles or glorious moments. It was marked instead by small, constant hardships, the taste of stale bread, the rasp of a dry throat, the sting of raw blisters, the weight of a rifle digging into a weary shoulder. For the men who endured it, the endless trudging forward became the truest symbol of Operation Barbarossa, not swift conquest, but the grinding, exhausting ordeal of men pushing themselves beyond human limits on roads that led only deeper into a nightmare. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the opening days of Operation Barbarossa were a descent into confusion and dread. Many were conscripts, young men who had only recently put on their uniforms. Some barely knew how to fire their rifles properly, and others had been issued weapons without ammunition. There were even cases where one rifle was shared between two men, with orders to pick up a fallen comrade's weapon if needed. When the German artillery thundered across the border in the early morning hours of June 22nd, thousands of Soviet soldiers were still asleep in their barracks or tents. The bombardment ripped through supply depots, airfields, and communication lines, throwing entire units into chaos before they could even organize a defense. Orders from commanders were delayed or lost altogether, and within hours, many divisions found themselves encircled or cut off from headquarters. The Soviet soldiers were told to hold their ground at all costs. Retreat was not only dishonorable but punishable. Political officers, known as commissars, reminded them that surrender could mean execution later, or worse, imprisonment in German hands. Fear gnawed at them from both directions. The advancing German army and the strict discipline of their own leadership. Food was scarce in these first days. Rations often consisted of dry bread, sometimes stale, and a thin soup if the unit cook still had supplies left. Water was collected hastily from rivers and streams, often dirty or muddy. Sleep was nearly impossible. The roar of artillery, the smoke rising on the horizon, and the cries of the wounded filled the nights, leaving little space for rest. The worst of it, however, was the sudden realization of how overwhelming the German advance was. Tanks rolled across open fields, cutting off Soviet trenches and scattering formations. Planes dominated the skies, their bombs and machine gun fire hammering positions without pause. Soldiers huddled in shallow dugouts, clutching their rifles, ears ringing, hearts racing. Many tried to fight bravely, standing firm as the enemy pressed forward, but just as many fled in panic, only to face the risk of being shot for desertion by their own officers. In this way, the opening days of Barbarossa became a nightmare within a nightmare for the average Soviet soldier. Hunger, fear, confusion, and exhaustion set in almost immediately, and as the Germans surged deeper into Soviet territory, the Red Army men who survived those early clashes began to realize that their suffering was only just beginning. By mid-June, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long, shimmering waves of heat across the open plains and dusty roads of Western Soviet territory. For soldiers on both sides of the conflict, the relentless summer heat quickly became one of the most punishing aspects of Operation Barbarossa. It was not the roar of artillery or the crack of rifles that brought weariness most sharply, but the slow, unyielding oppression of sun, dust, and thirst that pressed on the body with invisible weight. For German soldiers who had spent the first days marching eastward under blistering sun and cloudless skies, fatigue was constant. Boots already softened by sweat and long marches, now stuck to hot, hard dirt, scraping raw the soles of their feet. Uniforms, soaked from perspiration, clung uncomfortably, turning stiff as they dried in the heat. Faces glistened with sweat streaked by dust, giving the impression of smeared clay, and eyes burned constantly, red-rimmed from the combination of sand, sunlight, and exhaustion. Even in moments of relative calm, men could feel the sun's heat pressing through the fabric of their clothing, searing their skin like an invisible weight that they could not remove. Thirst became an unrelenting companion. Water rations, already sparse during the long marches, dwindled faster in the heat. Soldiers cupped their hands in streams, only to find the water muddy, cold, or tainted. Some drank directly from stagnant pools, risking illness, simply to ease the gnawing burn in their throats. The lips cracked, tongues stuck to the roofs of mouths, and every swallow of dry bread or stale rations became a trial. As the heat intensified, the body betrayed them. Dizziness, nausea, and trembling hands were constant reminders that survival was becoming more precarious with each step. For the Soviets, the summer was no less cruel. Soldiers hastily mobilized and ill-prepared for prolonged combat in open fields were often sent to hold positions without shade or access to clean water. Trenches offered little relief. They were shallow, poorly dug, and often lined with dust and rocks that reflected the sunlight. Troops crouched in these trenches, rifles in hand, desperately scanning for the enemy while the sun beat down on them, leaving skin raw, spirits low, and bodies dehydrated. Even the youngest and strongest men felt the toll, with fainting and collapse not uncommon along supply lines or on forced marches toward the front. Dust was another constant torment. The combined movement of trucks, horses, marching columns, and tanks kicked it up into thick clouds that clung to every surface. Inhaling it was unavoidable. Soldiers choked on it, coughing until lungs burned, eyes streamed, and the gritty particles rubbed raw against skin, turning sweat into a stinging paste. Men learned to pull their collars over their mouths or wrap handkerchiefs around their faces, but even these precautions were imperfect. Dust became an enemy that could not be fought with guns or artillery. It crept into every crevice, in every uniform, in every boot, and ground down morale slowly, day by day. Heatstroke and exhaustion were constant threats. Men would stagger along roads, legs trembling, mouths dry, heads spinning. Officers shouted commands that sometimes could barely be heard over the clamor of marching columns, tanks, and the hum of insects in the hot air. Those who lagged behind were disciplined, scolded, or left to find their own way forward. But often they collapsed before they could even rejoin the formation. The sight of comrades drooping, leaning against one another to stay upright, or slipping silently into unconsciousness became a daily, haunting image for all who marched. Even water, when available, was a fragile salvation. Streams were few, and stopping to drink slowed the advance. Soldiers had to balance the desperate need to quench their thirst with the demands of the campaign. Continuing forward meant survival of the mission, but stopping too long risked dehydration or falling behind entirely. For some, the choice was literally between life and duty, a cruel decision that haunted them long after the sun had set. The combination of heat, dust, and thirst created an eerie sameness to the landscape. Roads shimmered under the mid-morning sun. Dust clouds rolled endlessly along the horizon, hiding small bursts of activity. The sun reflected off abandoned farmhouses, burned-out tanks, and distant columns of smoke, blending reality with mirage. Soldiers could sometimes see figures ahead, only to realize that they were distorted by the heat waves rising from the ground. Each mile seemed longer than the last, each step heavier than the previous, until the human body became a vessel of only instinct, to drink, to move, to survive. Even at night, there was little relief. The heat of the day lingered, radiating from the earth and pressing down on tents, trenches, and open roads. Exhausted soldiers slept fitfully, waking repeatedly to sip precious water, wipe sweat from their eyes, or respond to the faint sounds of distant gunfire. Dreams were often filled with the sun, the dust, and the march, replaying the same painful steps over and over, as if the mind could not escape what the body had endured. For both German and Soviet troops, The summer heat and thirst were not simply uncomfortable, they were insidious. They weakened the body, eroded morale, and turned the vast landscape of the Soviet Union into a relentless adversary, as cruel and unyielding as any opposing army. Soldiers learned quickly that survival was as much about enduring the elements as it was about fighting the enemy. By the time the sun began to set over the endless fields, painting the horizon in molten gold, the men could scarcely lift their heads. Dust clung to sweat-soaked skin, lips cracked, throats burned, and muscles screamed from exhaustion. Yet the march, the campaign, and the war itself had no mercy. Dawn would come again, bringing with it more heat, more dust, and more miles to cover. The nightmare of Operation Barbarossa was as much about enduring the elements as it was about enduring enemy fire, and for every soldier on either side, the summer of 1941 would leave scars far deeper than any visible wound. Amid the chaos of the relentless advance, one of the most haunting and tragic aspects of Operation Barbarossa emerged: the capture of millions of Soviet soldiers. For the Wehrmacht mass surrenders were initially seen as signs of victory, proof that the Red Army could be broken, that the grand campaign was progressing as planned. But for the captured men, there was no glory, no respite, and very little hope. From the moment they were taken prisoner, Soviet soldiers faced a journey that was as punishing as the battlefield itself. Columns of prisoners were forced to march for miles, often under a scorching sun or the sudden onset of rain, through terrain that offered little shelter or comfort. Men who had survived artillery, machine guns, and ambushes now found themselves at the mercy of both exhaustion and their captors' strict discipline. Those who faltered or lagged behind were met with threats, strikes from rifle butts, or, in the worst cases, summary execution. Food for prisoners was almost non-existent. What little they were given was often spoiled, insufficient, or inedible. A slice of hard bread, a few sips of dirty water, or a handful of boiled grain became the daily allowance for thousands. The hunger gnawed relentlessly, turning every step into a painful ordeal. Soldiers resorted to scavenging whatever they could find along the march, tearing weeds from the ground or attempting to snatch morsels from abandoned barns. Many fell into delirium from exhaustion and starvation, their bodies too weak to continue. Yet the column moved forward relentlessly, indifferent to suffering. The psychological weight was immense. Fear became a constant companion. Prisoners did not know where they were being taken, how long the march would last, or whether they would survive to see another day. Stories of executions, starvation, and disease filtered back from those further along the route, deepening anxiety. Every shadow, every shout, every sudden movement could spark panic. Soldiers who had fought bravely on the front now faced an enemy in the form of helplessness itself. Disease spread quickly in these long columns. Soldiers walked side by side in cramped lines, sharing clothes, shoes, and contaminated water. Lice, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses were rampant. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Those who fell ill were left to the mercy of their own bodies, or, if they could not continue, abandoned along the roadsides. Families back home would rarely know the fate of their loved ones, leaving fear and uncertainty to compound the misery. Even the guards, often young German soldiers, were caught in the complexity of controlling millions of captives. They marched the men for days on end, shouting orders and forcing compliance, but fatigue and heat affected them as well. Mistakes were inevitable, tensions flared, and sometimes violence erupted indiscriminately. The captives were treated as numbers rather than human beings. Thousands of men shuffled forward, their individuality lost amidst the endless march. The scale of the tragedy is difficult to comprehend. In the first weeks of Barbarossa alone, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured, and over the months, millions would fall into German hands. Entire divisions vanished, not in battle but in captivity, weakened by hunger, disease, and despair. The camps that awaited many were often little better than open-air prisons, offering minimal shelter, meager food, and harsh discipline. For those who survived the initial march, the months that followed would be filled with monotony, suffering, and the constant threat of death from exposure or starvation. For German soldiers witnessing the columns, there was often a mixture of pity, indifference, and fear. They marched alongside the prisoners, aware that managing such numbers was almost impossible. The sight of men shuffling forward, hollow-eyed, ragged, and barefoot, was a grim reminder of the cost of war, not just in bullets and explosions, but in the slow erosion of humanity itself. Yet even in the darkest moments, small sparks of resilience emerged. Prisoners shared scraps of food, offered encouragement to those who stumbled, and sometimes whispered words of hope to keep spirits alive. In the silence of the marches, these fleeting gestures were a lifeline, tiny reminders that life, even in the grip of despair, persisted. By the end of the day, as the columns reached temporary resting points, exhaustion weighed heavier than any weapon. Soldiers collapsed onto the ground, bodies trembling from hunger and fatigue, while guards patrolled silently, eyes sharp for anyone attempting to stray or stop. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, haunted by images of missing comrades, burning villages, and the endless march that had begun long before dawn. For the millions of Soviet prisoners, the tragedy of capture was not confined to a single moment. It was an ordeal that stretched on, day after day, mile after mile, becoming a living nightmare in which the body and mind were tested to their absolute limits. Operation Barbarossa, with its ambition and its ferocity, was not just a war of battles, it was a war of endurance, suffering, and the relentless erosion of hope for those caught in its machinery. And as the sun set on the long columns, casting long shadows over the road, one fact became chillingly clear. For many, the nightmare had only just begun. As Operation Barbarossa swept deeper into the Soviet heartland, the countryside itself became a battlefield. For soldiers, the endless roads, dust, and exhaustion were one aspect of the nightmare. For civilians, the war was a relentless, fiery presence that tore through homes, barns and towns, leaving destruction and terror in its wake. From the first day of the invasion, villages along the western border were subjected to sudden and brutal raids. Artillery shells and bombs from the Luftwaffe fell indiscriminately, destroying entire streets in seconds. Thatched roofs ignited easily, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Families fled without time to gather possessions, clutching what little they could carry. Some carried children, others old family heirlooms, but almost nothing could shield them from the flames that spread through wooden structures like wildfire. The advance of German columns often left destruction behind them. Soldiers ordered to seize strategic points, sometimes burned barns and homes either intentionally or in the chaos of battle. Livestock was killed or taken to feed the advancing army. Food stores vanished in hours, leaving the remaining villagers with nothing to sustain themselves. The scorched earth left behind was a silent testimony to the rapid and devastating progress of the invasion. Fields that had once promised sustenance now lay trampled, littered with debris, and still smoking from recent attacks. Civilians tried to hide, seeking refuge in cellars, barns, or forest edges, yet the front lines were fluid and unpredictable. Artillery fire, strafing aircraft, and sudden tank columns often reached places considered safe. Families huddled together, listening to the terrifying symphony of war, explosions echoing across fields, the rattle of machine guns, and the distant, haunting cries of the wounded. Nights offered little relief. Even in darkness, fires illuminated the horizon, casting flickering shadows across villages that had once been quiet and ordinary. Soviet partisans and local militia sometimes attempted to defend their towns, but resistance was often futile against the mechanized German advance. The result was widespread destruction and displacement. Entire villages were depopulated overnight. Some residents fled eastward toward larger towns, carrying children, livestock, or the few possessions they could manage. Others hid in cellars or forests for days, surviving on berries, stolen bread, or river water, constantly fearful of discovery by soldiers from either side. For German soldiers marching through these villages, the experience was unsettling. While they were trained to focus on strategic objectives and orders, the sight of burning homes and fleeing civilians left an indelible mark. Some felt sympathy, others were hardened by routine, seeing destruction as a natural part of war. Yet even the most indifferent could not escape the smell of smoke, the sight of charred timber, and the eerie silence that followed the collapse of homes. The human cost extended beyond the immediate destruction. Families were torn apart, parents separated from children, and neighbors who had lived together for generations suddenly scattered. The psychological toll on both soldiers and civilians was immense. For civilians, the memory of a village in flames would linger for years, a reminder that the war was not fought solely in distant cities or on open battlefields, but in the intimate spaces of everyday life. In some villages, survivors returned after the initial invasion, only to find homes reduced to ash and belongings turned to rubble. Crops had been destroyed or stolen, wells contaminated, and livestock gone. Communities that had once been self-sufficient were now dependent on aid, if any could be spared. The sense of dislocation and helplessness was profound. Children, too young to understand strategy or ideology, were forced to watch their worlds burn. An indelible trauma that would mark the generation long after the war ended. Even as the Wehrmacht pushed further east, the pattern repeated itself endlessly. Each town captured, each village burned, each field devastated became part of the larger narrative of suffering that Operation Barbarossa had unleashed. Civilians were not just collateral damage. They were living in a war that had no mercy, caught between two armies whose priorities lay in conquest, speed, and survival rather than protection of the innocent. By the time the sun set over a smoking village, casting orange and black shadows across the ruined streets, the silence was almost deafening. Birds had fled, animals were scarce, and only the occasional distant gunfire reminded those who survived that the front line was never far away. For soldiers marching past, the devastation was a constant reminder of the human cost of their advance. For civilians, the flames that consumed their homes were only the beginning of a long journey into uncertainty, fear, and displacement. The villages in flames, burned barns, and destroyed homes were more than the loss of property. They were a profound assault on the rhythm of daily life. In these moments, Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign. It was a living nightmare that touched every layer of existence. Soldier, civilian, young, old, guilty, or innocent. And as the German columns pressed on and the smoke of each village rose into the sky, the shadow of this human suffering stretched endlessly eastward, marking the beginning of a tragic journey that would last for years. While the sun, dust, and endless marches tested the bodies of soldiers on both sides, another, more insidious enemy lurked in the shadows: disease. In the relentless push of Operation Barbarossa, hygiene became almost impossible to maintain, and the consequences were brutal. Lice, dysentery, infections, and the unwashed stench of sweat-soaked uniforms were constant companions, gnawing away at morale and health as effectively as any enemy bullet. In the columns of the Wehrmacht, soldiers rarely had the chance to bathe. Days of marching under scorching sun or through muddy terrain left them, covered in a layer of grime that hardened on the skin and stained clothing, sweat soaked through shirts and pants, drying into crusted, itchy patches. Men attempted to wash themselves when streams or rivers appeared, but time was always short, and water often contaminated. The effort was temporary. By the next day, dust and sweat reclaimed every inch of exposed skin. Lice spread with alarming speed. Cramped quarters, shared blankets, and rarely washed clothing created ideal conditions for infestation. Soldiers scratched incessantly, sometimes drawing blood, but the tiny pests persisted. The biting and itching became a constant distraction, gnawing at both patience and nerves. In some units, entire platoons were covered in lice, passing from one man to another like an invisible plague. Dysentery was another ever-present threat. Contaminated water, inadequate rations, and exhaustion weakened the digestive system, leaving soldiers susceptible. Diarrhea and vomiting became common, and those affected were often too weak to continue marching without help. Sanitary facilities were minimal or non-existent, and in the chaos of movement, men were forced to relieve themselves in fields or ditches, exposing themselves to further disease. The combination of infection, exhaustion, and dehydration created a vicious cycle that was difficult to escape. Infections from minor wounds could become deadly. Blisters caused by constant marching in wet or dusty boots. Scratches from barbed wire or cuts sustained during skirmishes often festered. Without proper treatment, these injuries turned septic, sometimes spreading through a man's body rapidly. Field medics were overwhelmed. Supplies of antiseptics or bandages were limited, and the speed of the campaign often prevented thorough care. Soldiers learned quickly that what might have been a minor scrape could become a life-threatening condition if ignored. Vermin were a constant presence. Rats infested camps and abandoned villages, scavenging for scraps and spreading disease further. Their constant movement gnawing at supplies, and sudden appearance at night unsettled men who were already on edge. Even in tents, the rustle of rats across bedding could prevent sleep, leaving soldiers in a fog of exhaustion the following day. Soviet soldiers faced similar challenges, often under even worse conditions. Hastily conscripted men, sometimes poorly equipped and trained, were pressed into service without adequate clothing or bedding. Dugouts and trenches offered limited shelter, and the lack of clean water and food accelerated the spread of lice, dysentery, and skin infections. Medical supplies were scarce, leaving field hospitals overwhelmed with cases that might have been easily treatable under normal conditions. Hygiene, already a mundane concern in peacetime, became a matter of life and death. Soldiers learned to prioritize water for drinking over cleaning themselves. Clothing went unwashed for weeks, boots remained soaked or dusty, and lice became a normal part of daily life. Skin diseases, rashes, and sores were tolerated because stopping to care for them could mean falling behind the march or missing the next order of battle. Beyond the physical toll, the psychological strain was significant. Living in filth, surrounded by the constant discomfort of vermin and disease, eroded morale. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and now perpetually itchy, nauseated, or in pain. The combination of environmental stress, combat fatigue, and the oppressive weight of disease created a sense of helplessness. Men who had once felt strong and capable found themselves weakened by conditions they could not control. Constantly aware that every step forward increased the risk of illness or injury, the misery of poor hygiene intertwined with the broader suffering of Operation Barbarossa. Blistered feet, burned villages, endless marches, hunger, and fear. Each layer compounded the next, and the human body began to show the cumulative toll. Even the strongest soldiers were humbled by the relentless combination of nature, disease, and fatigue. Realizing that survival required more than courage, it required endurance against forces far beyond the battlefield. As the days and weeks stretched on, these invisible enemies, lice, dysentery, infections, became as feared as the German or Soviet guns. Soldiers learned to move cautiously, conserve water, and treat wounds as best they could, but there was no escape. The nightmare of Operation Barbarossa was not only measured in battles won or lost, but also in the unseen suffering of bodies and minds pushed to the limits of endurance, where dirt and disease were as lethal as bullets. In the first days of Operation Barbarossa, soldiers had relied on the limited rations provided during the initial push. But as the Wehrmacht columns advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the strain on supply lines became painfully evident. Roads clogged with vehicles, destroyed bridges, and disrupted communications meant that food often failed to reach the men who desperately needed it. And so, hunger began to creep into the daily lives of soldiers, slow and unrelenting, gnawing at morale and endurance alike. At first, the rations were simple but sufficient: a small portion of bread, a tin of canned meat, or a handful of biscuits. Soldiers ate quickly, out of habit or necessity, and carried on marching. But as days turned into weeks, and columns stretched further east, the supplies dwindled. Field kitchens could not keep pace with the relentless advance. Convoys were delayed by broken roads, enemy action, or the sheer difficulty of moving food across long distances. The result was predictable. Soldiers began to feel the hunger in every step, every muscle, and every thought. Hunger affected both body and mind. Strength diminished, reactions slowed, and concentration faltered. Men who had once marched steadily and efficiently began to stumble, pausing to lean against wagons, trees, or one another. The mental strain of an empty stomach was compounded by fatigue, heat, dust, and the constant stress of enemy fire. Some soldiers experienced stomach cramps, dizziness, or nausea, and the small ration of food they eventually received barely eased the gnawing emptiness. Desperation led to measures that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Soldiers scavenged abandoned farms, breaking into barns and cellars in search of anything edible. A sack of potatoes, a few grains of grain, or even a handful of berries became treasures. Theft, though frowned upon by officers, became a survival tactic, and arguments over scarce food broke out among men too exhausted and famished to maintain discipline. The quiet dignity of the march was replaced with tense murmurs, whispered complaints, and the occasional clash over scraps of bread. Even when food was found, preparation was often minimal. Fires were difficult to maintain safely in a war zone, so cans were eaten cold, grains were consumed without boiling, and raw vegetables or roots were washed quickly in muddy streams. Soldiers ate hungrily, often chewing in silence while marching or huddled in temporary camps. Their thoughts focused entirely on filling the empty void in their stomachs. The taste of dust and grit mixed with every bite, a constant reminder that survival was becoming increasingly desperate. The Soviets faced similar struggles. Their troops, poorly equipped and hastily mobilized, often had even less to eat. Fields had been abandoned, supply lines destroyed, and food stores seized or burned by retreating units. Soldiers foraged wherever possible, digging for roots, collecting berries, or even attempting to hunt small game with makeshift weapons. The effort was exhausting, and many were already weakened from continuous marches, combat, and exposure to the elements. Hunger added another layer of suffering, leaving men gaunt, slow, and vulnerable. In some cases, starvation led to profound psychological effects. Soldiers became irritable, despondent, or consumed by thoughts of food. The camaraderie that had sustained men through marches and minor skirmishes began to fray. Complaints grew louder, small arguments escalated, and minor disputes sometimes erupted into violence. Hunger combined with fatigue became a silent force that threatened not only physical survival, but the social bonds that allowed soldiers to function as units. Commanders were aware of the crisis, but options were limited. Officers attempted to ration the dwindling supplies, enforcing strict portions and forbidding any deviation. They organized foraging parties and scavenging missions, often at great risk, in an effort to supplement meager provisions. But the distances were long, enemy patrols were nearby, and exhaustion made even these small efforts a monumental task. Soldiers who had marched for miles with little rest were now being asked to exert more energy to find food, creating a vicious cycle of hunger and fatigue. The result was a slow, grinding deterioration. Every soldier felt the hollow ache in his stomach, the weakness in his limbs, and the cloud of distraction that hunger brought. Meals, when they did arrive, were barely sufficient to sustain movement, and the fear of missing the next ration haunted every moment. Villages and towns along the route, often burned or abandoned, offered only glimpses of potential relief, and the march continued, relentless, toward an uncertain future. In this way, food became more than nourishment. It became a measure of hope, a scarce resource that could determine life or death. Soldiers pressed on through endless roads, dust, and heat, carrying the invisible weight of hunger with every step. And as the sun set on the desolate fields, casting long shadows over exhausted columns, the gnawing reminder remained. Operation Barbarossa was a campaign not only of bullets and fire but also of human endurance, where hunger was as cruel an enemy as any opposing army. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, the vast plains of the Soviet Union began to change. The relentless sun that had scorched fields and blistered boots faded earlier each evening, leaving long shadows across the dusty roads. Soldiers on both sides suddenly faced a new adversary, the creeping chill of nightfall. The thin uniforms that had been adequate for summer heat now offered little protection, and shivering became a nightly ritual for weary men. For the German columns, the first signs of cold arrived subtly. By late afternoon, the breeze carried a sharpness that cut through sweat-soaked clothing, chilling skin that had become accustomed to the warmth. As the sun sank behind distant trees and farmhouses, temperatures dropped rapidly. Men tried to prepare for the night by adding layers, wrapping scarves tightly, or huddling around small fires, but warmth was fleeting. Every gust of wind carried the bite of approaching winter, and the soldiers could feel their energy draining faster than before. Sleep became even more difficult. In makeshift camps along roadsides or in abandoned villages, men collapsed onto the ground, their bodies stiff from hours of marching and muscles still sore from blisters and bruises. They huddled together wherever possible, trying to share body heat. Arms wrapped around each other in a quiet, instinctive attempt at survival. Blankets were scarce, and tents were often reserved for officers or kept packed for mobility. The ground itself seemed to suck heat away, cold seeping into bones already weakened by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. For Soviet soldiers, the nights brought a similar torment. Trenches offered little protection from the wind, and damp soil carried a penetrating chill. Those on guard duty, alert to the slightest noise, endured the cold standing upright for hours, shivering uncontrollably. Thin coats and worn boots provided minimal insulation, and soldiers often wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find, pieces of burlap, torn blankets, or the remnants of captured clothing. Even so, the cold infiltrated, settling into joints, making every movement an uncomfortable effort. The psychological impact of these cold nights was profound. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear were compounded by the creeping chill. Shivering bodies made men irritable, short-tempered, or withdrawn. Sleep was fragmented, punctuated by dreams of warmth, food, or home that vanished the moment consciousness returned. The darkness was not comforting. It amplified the sense of isolation, vulnerability, and the unknown. Every rustle in the brush, every distant sound, became a potential threat, magnified by cold-stiffened nerves and the lingering fatigue of relentless marching and fighting. Fires, when they could be built safely, became small sanctuaries. Soldiers clustered around them, warming frozen hands and clasping cold feet against fleeting heat. Conversation was subdued, almost reverent, as men whispered stories of home or attempted jokes to stave off despair. Smoke from the fires curled into the night sky, blending with the mist of dew and the distant haze of battle, giving the landscape a ghostly, almost dreamlike quality. But even the warmth of a fire was temporary. Once extinguished for safety or necessity, the cold returned, enveloping every man in its silent, unyielding grasp. Illness became a greater threat during these first cold nights. Exhausted, underfed, and wet from previous rains or dew, soldiers were more susceptible to colds, fevers, and respiratory infections. Shivering weakened immune systems further, and minor ailments that might have been tolerable in summer became debilitating. Those who fell ill struggled to keep pace with the march or maintain guard, risking punishment if they could not continue. The night was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance in both body and mind. Despite the misery, soldiers developed coping routines, huddling together, wrapping themselves tightly in whatever layers were available, and sharing the little warmth they could generate became instinctive. Officers encouraged brief stretches or light movements to keep blood flowing, while comrades exchanged advice on how best to layer clothing or tuck themselves into the earth to block wind. These small measures were acts of quiet ingenuity, yet they never fully dispelled the chill that seemed to reach into every corner of the body. By dawn, the frost of early autumn often coated blankets, uniforms, and the ground itself. The first light revealed mist rising from fields and rivers, glinting against boots and rifles, emphasizing the transition from the punishing heat of summer to the harsh endurance of cold nights. Men rose reluctantly, muscles stiff, teeth chattering, hearts heavy with the knowledge that another night of shivering lay ahead. The war itself had not eased. If anything, it had grown harsher, now claiming comfort and warmth as easily as it did life and energy. The first cold nights of autumn were a quiet torment, a new dimension of suffering added to hunger, disease, and exhaustion. For soldiers on both sides, each evening was a test of survival, a ritual of endurance, and a reminder that Operation Barbarossa was as much a battle against the elements as it was against the enemy. The shivering columns, the whispered attempts at warmth, and the frost-laden mornings were all part of the long, grinding nightmare that would stretch across months and thousands of miles, marking every soldier with the slow, invisible scars of exposure, fatigue, and endurance. As autumn progressed, a new and unrelenting adversary emerged across the Soviet landscape, the Rasputitsa. This infamous season of mud, triggered by relentless rains and thawing earth, transformed the roads and fields into vast, treacherous quagmires. For soldiers and vehicles alike, it was as if the land itself had turned against them, swallowing boots, wagons, and tanks in endless, sucking muck. German columns, previously moving with speed and coordination, now struggled through the thick, viscous sludge that clung to every wheel and boot. Horses sank into mud up to their knees, carts and wagons bogged down, leaving supplies stranded for days at a time. Every step became a laborious effort, each movement slow and exhausting. Soldiers waded through the mire, boots heavy with clinging earth, sweat mixing with rain-soaked grime, turning marches into near-constant physical punishment. The smell of mud, wet, wool, and decay was pervasive. Rainwater pooled in ruts and trenches, mixing with spilled rations, horse droppings, and stagnant water to create a pungent, almost suffocating stench. Soldiers' socks and boots were perpetually wet, chafing skin and causing blisters that worsened with each step. Cold water seeped into uniforms, chilling bodies already weakened from long marches, scarce food, and previous exposure. The sensation was endless, a slow grinding of morale and strength as the landscape swallowed men whole. Vehicles became a constant source of frustration. Trucks, motorcycles, and even the heavy artillery meant to support the advance often sank into the mud, leaving crews stranded for hours or days. Soldiers pushed and pulled, digging around wheels with shovels or bare hands, boots slipping in the thick clay, while rain continued to pour relentlessly. Sometimes, entire convoys had to be abandoned, supplies lost, and the march continued on foot, heavier with ration packs, weapons, and the weight of exhaustion. The Soviets, defending their homeland, faced similar challenges. Their defensive positions in trenches or forests became waterlogged, turning protective lines into ankle-deep or knee-deep bogs. Movement became slow and precarious, and attempts at counterattacks or ambushes were often foiled by the impossibility of traveling silently or quickly through the mire. Soldiers slipped, fell, and struggled to lift boots that seemed glued to the earth. Even when hiding from German patrols, mud betrayed their position, leaving deep tracks and sloshing echoes that gave away movements. Sleep and rest offered little relief. Camps set along muddy roads were soaked, with tents collapsing under rain and sodden blankets. Soldiers tried to wring water from clothing, lay on raised wooden planks, or pile whatever dry debris they could find to stay off the ground, but warmth and dryness were fleeting. Nights were filled with the constant sound of rain falling into puddles, boots squelching as men tried to move quietly, and the endless groan of wheels stuck in mud. Exhaustion became physical and mental, a weight pressing from the inside out. Morale suffered greatly during the Rasputitsa. Soldiers could see miles of mud-strewn fields ahead, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly with no relief. Every movement was a reminder that distance alone would not protect them from misery. Arguments flared over stalled vehicles, ration distribution, and the seemingly eternal march through muck that consumed time, energy, and hope. Even the strongest and most disciplined men felt the creeping despair as days blurred together in a uniform haze of gray, wet, and heavy soil. The effects were not only physical but strategic. The German advance slowed dramatically, giving Soviet forces crucial time to regroup, fortify positions, and plan counterattacks. Tanks became immobilized, convoys stalled, and the rhythm of the campaign, carefully planned in Berlin, faltered under the unrelenting grip of mud. For soldiers on the ground, this delay offered no relief from suffering. It only prolonged exposure to wet, cold, and exhaustion. Yet within this misery, small acts of ingenuity and resilience emerged. Soldiers learned to reinforce paths with logs, planks, and stones, creating makeshift corduroy roads through the worst sections. Teams of men pushed, pulled, and coordinated to extract vehicles, sometimes for hours at a time, sharing the burden and developing a quiet camaraderie born of mutual struggle. These efforts offered temporary success, small victories in a landscape otherwise dominated by relentless mud and rain. The Rasputitsa was not just a physical challenge, it became a psychological battlefield. Soldiers trudged through endless mire, every step sapping energy, soaking clothes, and weakening resolve. The mud claimed boots, gear, and spirits alike, a cruel reminder that nature itself could be as unforgiving as the enemy. Each day in the Rasputitsa tested endurance, patience, and willpower, leaving men marked not only by exhaustion but by a slow, pervasive dread that the next mile might be even worse than the last. By the end of each day, the columns were coated in mud from head to boot, faces streaked with grime, muscles aching from constant effort, and boots heavy with thick clay. Soldiers could only collapse briefly, knowing that the march would resume with the next dawn. Operation Barbarossa, once a campaign of rapid conquest, had slowed under the weight of the Rasput, revealing that even the most disciplined army could be humbled by the unyielding, merciless power of the land itself. By late autumn, the initial rush of Operation Barbarossa had slowed to a grinding crawl. The German advance, once swift and seemingly unstoppable, now faltered under the combined weight of exhaustion, logistical breakdown, and relentless environmental challenges. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles with the momentum of early victories began to feel the creeping reality that this campaign would not be over quickly, if it ever ended at all. The men in the Wehrmacht, trained for rapid strikes and decisive maneuvers, now faced the frustration of stalled progress. Daily marches became longer, more exhausting, yet offered diminishing returns. Roads churned to mud by autumn rains, supply lines stretched thin, and the constant threat of ambush or counterattack made every advance perilous. Each day demanded the same exertion but delivered less in the way of measurable success, eroding morale steadily. Exhaustion was everywhere. Soldiers moved with heavy limbs, faces drawn and pale, feet blistered from continuous marches through mud and dust, bodies weakened from hunger and disease. Even officers felt the strain, shouting orders through fatigue-clouded minds and trying to enforce discipline among men who could barely stand. The routines of daily life, breakfast, march, skirmish, set-up camp, had become mechanical, a blur of effort with little sense of accomplishment. Each step forward was a test of endurance, patience, and sheer will. Frustration was equally pervasive. Men who had expected rapid victory found themselves bogged down, literally and figuratively. Trucks and tanks were immobilized by mud, bridges destroyed, and roads impassable. Communication with command was slow, orders sometimes outdated by hours or even days. Soldiers grumbled quietly in the background, voices heavy with weariness, while officers attempted to maintain order despite the mounting tension. Small conflicts over rations, equipment, and assignments became more frequent as patience wore thin. Beyond fatigue and frustration, the creeping realization of prolonged conflict began to weigh on every soldier's mind. Initial plans had assumed a swift collapse of Soviet defenses, but reports from the front lines suggested otherwise. Resistance remained stubborn. Local populations provided aid to partisans, and Soviet counterattacks, though disorganized at times, disrupted supply routes and slowed progress. For many men, the dream of a fast, triumphant campaign faded, replaced by the dawning understanding that Operation Barbarossa would be a long, grueling ordeal. The mental toll was profound. Soldiers had to reconcile their exhaustion, hunger, and fear with the knowledge that weeks, perhaps months, of this struggle lay ahead. Sleep was often fitful, interrupted by rain, cold, or the distant rumble of artillery. The mind replayed the endless marches, the faces of fallen comrades, the smoke rising from burned villages, and the despair of captured prisoners. Anxiety became a constant companion, and moments of quiet reflection were tinged with dread. The stalled advance also exacerbated the physical suffering of men. Injuries that might have healed during brief lulls in activity worsened due to continuous exertion. Blisters became infected, minor wounds festered, and the persistent wetness and cold weakened bodies further. The combination of exposure, fatigue, and limited nutrition left many soldiers unable to perform even routine duties without discomfort or pain. Even simple tasks, like carrying a ration pack or pushing a vehicle through mud, became monumental. Tactically, the stagnation frustrated commanders at every level. Plans that had seemed feasible in summer were now impossible in autumn's quagmire. Supply lines were vulnerable to partisan raids or Soviet artillery, vehicles sank into mud, and entire divisions were slowed by the most minor of obstacles. For soldiers on the ground, the impact was immediate. Delays meant longer exposure to cold, hunger, and the threat of combat, reinforcing the feeling of helplessness. Yet amid this hardship, small acts of perseverance emerged. Soldiers shared rations, improvised ways to move stuck vehicles, and offered support to comrades struggling with illness or exhaustion. These small gestures, though minor in the scale of the campaign, provided glimmers of humanity amid the grinding misery of stalled advance. Each act of cooperation reminded men that, despite fatigue and frustration, survival was possible if they leaned on each other. By the end of each day, the columns of soldiers trudged forward with heavy, reluctant steps. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, fields turned to mud, villages burned or abandoned, and the horizon blurred in mist and rain. The initial optimism of rapid conquest was gone, replaced by the grim recognition that Operation Barbarossa was not a sprint but a marathon of endurance, a slow, punishing test of human resilience, patience, and determination. The stalled advance marked a turning point in the campaign, a moment when the soldiers truly understood the harsh reality of the war they were fighting. Every mile gained came at enormous physical, emotional, and psychological cost. Every night spent shivering in damp clothes, every meal eaten in silence, every step through mud, dust, or frost was a reminder that survival, not glory, had become the primary goal. The nightmare of Barbarossa was far from over, and the men marching eastward faced the long, grueling months ahead with only their endurance to rely on. As the Wehrmacht pressed further into Soviet territory, the initial wave of shock and rapid advancement began to meet a fierce, increasingly organized resistance. The Soviet forces, battered but not defeated, had regrouped and learned from early defeats. Counterattacks became more frequent, precise, and terrifying in their unpredictability, leaving German soldiers on edge, their nerves constantly taut, and the fear of ambush an unrelenting companion. For the advancing German columns, the first hints of coordinated Soviet action often arrived in whispers, a distant rumble of artillery that seemed to come from nowhere, reports of partisan activity disrupting supply lines or sporadic skirmishes at unexpected crossroads. Soldiers quickly realized that no area, however empty it seemed, could be trusted. Every village, forest, or river crossing became a potential trap, and every step carried the anxiety of sudden confrontation. The psychological toll was profound. Men had become accustomed to marching with purpose, focusing on the rhythm of steps, the drag of boots, and the monotonous sound of wheels in mud. Now, every noise, a snapping twig, a distant shout, or the flutter of a bird startled into flight, became a potential threat. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale, knowing that fear, once allowed to grow unchecked, could spread through an entire unit, paralyzing initiative and slowing progress. Soviet counterattacks ranged from small, tactical strikes to larger coordinated assaults. Ambushes in forested areas or along muddy roads disrupted formations, forcing columns to halt abruptly. Tanks and artillery, hidden behind ridges or dense trees, struck suddenly, scattering infantry and damaging vehicles. Soldiers who had felt confident in open fields now learned that terrain itself could be a weapon when guided by skilled defenders. Even the most experienced men were forced to reconsider every movement, constantly scanning, listening, and anticipating the enemy's next maneuver. Partisans and local militias compounded the stress. These fighters, using their knowledge of the terrain, attacked supply lines, sabotaged vehicles, and harassed units during rest or march. Communication lines were cut, convoys delayed, and small units isolated. The omnipresence of such threats created an atmosphere of perpetual vigilance, where soldiers slept lightly if at all, always ready to respond to sudden danger. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease only intensified the fear, making every encounter more harrowing. The intensity of Soviet attacks also underscored the limits of the Wehrmacht's initial strategy. Quick strikes and blitzkrieg tactics depended on momentum, coordination, and surprise. When slowed by mud, exhaustion, and logistical difficulties, these advantages diminished. Soviet forces seized the opportunity, launching counterattacks that exploited gaps, overextended units, or stalled advances. Soldiers were forced into defensive positions they had not anticipated, often with inadequate cover, little reinforcements, and dwindling supplies. Combat during these counterattacks was chaotic. Machine guns rattled in forested ambushes, artillery fire shook the ground, and rifle shots echoed through villages. Soldiers had to adapt rapidly, moving under fire, securing flanks, and retreating when necessary. Fear was constant, not only of being hit, but of failing comrades or leaving wounded behind. Panic could spread swiftly, and only the discipline instilled through months of training prevented complete disarray. Nighttime brought little relief. Soviet forces often attacked under cover of darkness, exploiting the limited visibility and confusion. Soldiers tried to rest, but the threat of sudden raids, artillery shelling, or sniper fire meant that sleep was broken, fitful, and shallow. Fires and lights were minimized to avoid detection, leaving men shivering in darkness, anxiety gnawing as they imagined the next ambush. Even in moments of quiet, the memory of surprise attacks lingered, a ghostly presence that made the mind alert to danger even when the body ached for rest. The human cost was evident. Wounded soldiers were often left behind or carried under dangerous conditions, and the loss of comrades reinforced the psychological weight of each counterattack. Men learned to move cautiously, respect terrain, and anticipate traps. But the knowledge offered little comfort when faced with the chaos of sudden Soviet strikes. Survival became a matter of vigilance, experience, and sometimes sheer luck. Despite these challenges, small victories offered moments of relief. Units that successfully repelled attacks, secured positions, or rescued stranded comrades experienced fleeting boosts in morale. Yet these moments were fragile, overshadowed by the relentless reality that every advance could provoke another ambush. Every village held secrets, and every forest concealed hidden dangers. Soldiers understood that in the theater of Barbarossa, fear was not weakness. It was a necessary companion for survival. By the end of each day, the cumulative impact of counterattacks was unmistakable. Exhausted men, covered in mud and grime, huddled in makeshift camps, nursing blisters, hunger, and the constant ache of tension. Every sound in the night, every shadow in the forest, was a reminder that the enemy could strike at any moment. Operation Barbarossa had become a living nightmare not only because of the distances and battles involved but because the very land itself had been transformed into a maze of potential death, where every step forward carried the weight of uncertainty, fear, and the ever-present danger of sudden attack. As autumn waned, the first truly harsh winter of Operation Barbarossa settled over the Eastern Front, transforming the already grueling campaign into a nightmare of cold, deprivation, and relentless struggle. Soldiers, hardened by months of marching, fighting, and enduring mud, dust, and hunger, now faced a new, merciless enemy, the bitter, unyielding frost of the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted rapidly as November gave way to December, and the wind carried a sharp, penetrating chill that seemed to cut through every layer of uniform. Thin coats, once sufficient for autumn evenings, proved useless against the sub-zero nights. Fingers and toes turned numb, faces burned under the icy gusts, and breath crystallized in the frigid air, forming white clouds that hung around every soldier like a ghostly reminder of exposure. Huddling together offered some temporary warmth, but the cold was relentless, creeping into bones and chilling muscles. Exhausted from endless marching, frostbite became an immediate concern. Soldiers noticed the first signs in fingers and toes, slowly turning pale, hard, and painful. In some cases, extremities swelled and developed painful sores. Medical supplies were scarce, and treatment was often improvisational. Warm hands pressed against frostbitten skin, or soaking extremities in lukewarm water when possible. For many, the frostbite went untreated, leaving permanent damage or forcing them to continue marching despite excruciating pain. Weapons and equipment were not immune to the cold. Rifles jammed as lubricants thickened or froze. Artillery mechanisms became stiff and difficult to operate. Soldiers struggled to maintain readiness while simultaneously battling the freezing conditions. Even simple tasks, loading ammunition, adjusting sights, or repairing vehicles, took longer and demanded more energy, compounding fatigue. Men learned to warm their hands with small fires or by keeping them tucked in clothing. But every attempt at preparation could be undone in seconds by exposure to wind and snow. Hunger intensified in the cold. The body burned more energy simply to maintain warmth, yet rations were still meager and supply lines remained vulnerable or broken. Soldiers scavenged frozen fields, hunting small game or seeking whatever edible remnants might be available in abandoned villages. Meals, when possible, were eaten quickly and often cold, the taste of snow and frost mixing with each bite. Starvation became an ever-present companion, gnawing not only at strength but at morale. The landscape itself became a trap. Frozen rivers, once barriers only in spring thaw, now turned slippery, treacherous, and disorienting. Snow-covered fields concealed ruts, frozen mud, and hidden debris. Trees, stripped bare, offered no shelter, and the horizon stretched endlessly, white and silent, broken only by the occasional movement of distant columns. The beauty of the winter scenery was deceptive. Beneath the serene surface lay a world designed to exhaust, freeze, and disorient every man who attempted to traverse it. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to harsh winters and somewhat better prepared for the cold, gained a subtle advantage. They fortified positions, used knowledge of the terrain to set traps, and leveraged the weather as a natural ally. German troops, however, were poorly equipped for extended winter operations. Boots and gloves were inadequate, clothing thin, and tents insufficient. Every step became an act of endurance, every night a test of survival. Psychological strain increased alongside physical suffering. Men shivered through nights, sometimes awake for hours, eyes darting to shadows, imagining threats that might not exist. Dreams of warmth, home, and meals grew vivid, taunting soldiers awake in the freezing darkness. Exhaustion, hunger, and frostbite created a sense of helplessness. Each day demanded extraordinary effort simply to stay alive. Rumors of comrades lost to the cold spread quickly, heightening anxiety and reminding everyone that survival could be as uncertain as battle. Fire offered the only temporary relief. Soldiers clutched the warmth of small campfires, using whatever fuel they could find, wood, brush, or even crates abandoned in villages. Smoke rose in curling ribbons, carrying away some of the cold, but also signaling positions to enemy forces. Fires had to be small and carefully tended, and even then, warmth never penetrated fully into wet, numb clothing. Huddling near others offered additional heat, but the cold always returned, seeping back into skin and bone, refusing to relent. The winter also magnified the misery of disease and exhaustion. Coughs and fevers spread easily among men cramped in tents or huddled together, while frostbitten extremities often became infected. Combined with starvation, this created a deadly mix that weakened soldiers and limited their ability to fight or march. The front lines became a theater not just of human combat but of human endurance, where survival required constant vigilance, strength, and an acceptance of suffering as part of daily life. By the end of each day, German soldiers trudged forward with stiffened limbs, frozen faces, and the heavy weight of snow-laden gear. The frost-covered landscape stretched endlessly before them, white and silent, yet teeming with danger. Operation Barbarossa had transformed from a campaign of rapid conquest into a grinding, frozen ordeal, testing every ounce of human resilience. Survival was no longer measured only in victories or territory gained, but in the ability to endure the freezing night, maintain hope amid starvation, and continue moving through a landscape that seemed determined to crush body and spirit alike. The first winter of Barbarossa was not merely a change of seasons, it was a cruel, unrelenting trial, a living nightmare that would haunt every soldier who endured it. Each frostbitten night, each frozen meal, each shivering march was a reminder that the Eastern Front was as much a battle against the elements as it was against men armed with rifles and tanks. The cold had arrived, and with it, a new level of suffering that would shape the course of the campaign and the fate of all who marched into it. As the harsh winter of 1941 deepened, soldiers found themselves struggling not only on the march but within their frozen camps, makeshift refuges that offered little comfort against the relentless cold. These temporary encampments, often little more than hastily pitched tents, abandoned barns, or snow-laden fields, became the setting for a nightly battle against frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant gnaw of hunger. For the men of the Wehrmacht, each night presented a cruel paradox, a brief respite from marching and combat, yet a stark confrontation with the biting cold. The ground, frozen solid or coated in layers of icy slush, offered no warmth. Blankets, when available, were thin and damp, providing minimal insulation. Soldiers huddled together for shared warmth, arms wrapped around each other, bodies pressed close to stave off the chill. Even so, shivering was constant, gnawing at bones and muscles and turning sleep into a fleeting, restless illusion. Fires became lifelines. Small stoves or open flames offered precious warmth and a chance to thaw frozen boots and gloves. But fuel was scarce and had to be carefully rationed. Smoke from these fires hung in the air, curling in the frigid night, sometimes drawing unwanted attention from enemy scouts. Soldiers rotated shifts, tending flames, anxious to keep embers alive long enough to warm themselves, cook meager rations, or simply stave off despair. Even a few minutes near the fire could mean the difference between numbness and fleeting comfort. Boots and clothing, often soaked from marching through snow, ice, or slush, were another constant source of suffering. Men removed their footwear in attempts to dry it by fires or next to their bodies, but warmth rarely penetrated deeply, leaving toes stiff, pale, and prone to frostbite. Socks were few, sometimes shared between comrades, and gloves were worn thin from repeated use. Clothing was layered wherever possible, but cold seeped into every gap, testing both body and willpower. Sleeping arrangements were crude and uncomfortable. Soldiers lay on frozen ground, wooden planks, or piles of straw, attempting to conserve body heat while remaining alert to the ever-present threat of enemy attack. Sleep was shallow and broken by shivers, the discomfort of frost-nipped skin, or distant noises, the crack of tree branches under snow, the distant rumble of artillery, or the shuffle of men on patrol. Rest was not a luxury but a survival tactic, brief and precious, often interrupted before dreams could take hold. Mealtime offered no real reprieve. Rations were meager and difficult to prepare in freezing conditions. Water often froze in containers, and even heated food cooled almost instantly in the icy air. Soldiers ate quickly, hungrily, knowing that their bodies needed calories to generate warmth. Yet the effort to thaw food or water was exhausting. In some cases, men scavenged from abandoned villages, barns, or fields, seeking anything edible to supplement the dwindling supplies. Each meal, no matter how small, was an act of survival rather than comfort. Illness and injury were exacerbated by these conditions. Frostbite, trench foot, colds, and fevers were rampant. Soldiers who could not maintain body heat suffered more severe symptoms, and medical attention was limited. Those too weak or sick struggled to remain with their units, while comrades shared what little aid was available, from blankets to warm water, in desperate attempts to preserve life and morale. Each man became acutely aware that the camp, meant to be a refuge, was a battlefield in its own right. Despite the hardships, routines and small comforts persisted. Men adjusted sleeping positions, rotated watch shifts, and shared stories or whispered memories to maintain sanity and camaraderie. Small victories, warming frozen toes, successfully lighting a fire, or receiving an extra portion of bread, became profoundly significant. These moments, though fleeting, reminded soldiers that endurance was possible and that even in the harshest conditions, life could persist. The frozen camps also highlighted the psychological strain of winter warfare. Darkness came early, stretching nights long and cold. Isolation and fatigue weighed heavily, and men coped with anxiety, fear, and the creeping sense of hopelessness in their own ways. Conversations were sparse, laughter rare, but shared glances, nods, and small gestures offered reassurance. Each soldier understood that survival depended not only on physical strength, but also on mental resilience, trust in comrades, and the ability to endure discomfort without losing hope. As the nights dragged on, soldiers' bodies and minds became increasingly attuned to the rhythms of the cold. Every breath fogged in the air, every movement stiffened by frost, every step over frozen ground required conscious effort. Yet, even in these frozen encampments, men found ways to persist. to warm themselves, to eat, to rest, and to prepare for the dawn that would bring another day of marching, fighting, and struggling against the merciless Russian winter. Life in frozen camps was a test of human resilience at its most fundamental level, a battle against cold, exhaustion, hunger, and the creeping despair of endless suffering. For every soldier who survived the night, there was relief, but no real comfort, only the knowledge that the winter, like the war itself, would continue demanding endurance, courage, and the fragile hope that the next sunrise might bring a slightly easier path forward. As winter tightened its grip on the Eastern Front, hunger became a relentless, gnawing companion for every soldier. Rations, already scarce during the autumn advance, had dwindled to near nothing in the freezing months. Supply lines, bogged down by mud, snow, and the ongoing chaos of battle, failed to reach frontline troops with any regularity. Men found themselves facing an enemy more pervasive than frost or gunfire, the empty stomach. For the German soldiers, each day began with the aching awareness of scarcity. Boots were laced tightly, fingers rubbed together to generate warmth, yet hunger gnawed deeper than cold ever could. Canned food, once a staple, had run out or been frozen solid. Bread, when it existed, was rationed in minute pieces, and coffee or tea became rare luxuries, remembered more for their absence than their taste. Soldiers' bodies, burning energy just to survive the cold, demanded more fuel than could be provided, and the result was a constant gnawing hunger that refused to abate. Desperation led to grim improvisation. Leather boots and belts, boiled or softened over meager fires, became a source of sustenance when no other options were available. Soldiers chewed and boiled them to extract whatever nutrients or warmth they could, the taste bitter and the texture unyielding, yet it was consumed with the quiet resignation of those who knew no alternatives existed. Even snow, mixed with a little sugar or scraps of bread, was sometimes ingested to stave off the relentless craving for food. The psychological impact of starvation was severe. Hunger did more than weaken muscles. It eroded morale, clouded judgment, and amplified fear. Men became irritable, exhausted, and prone to despair. Small disagreements could flare into arguments, and the constant preoccupation with finding food overshadowed all other concerns. Soldiers were forced to calculate every calorie, ration every morsel, and conserve energy wherever possible. Every meal, however meager, became an event, a moment of temporary relief from the gnawing ache of emptiness in the stomach. Scavenging became a necessary skill. Columns scoured abandoned villages for anything edible, frozen vegetables, grains hidden in barns, or scraps left behind by fleeing civilians. Soldiers even hunted small game when possible, rabbits, birds, or the occasional stray animal, cooking their catch over tiny, precarious fires. These efforts were perilous. Moving away from the main camp in search of food exposed men to frost, injury, or enemy attack. Yet starvation left few choices, and survival demanded risk as much as endurance. The Soviet soldiers, too, faced similar hardships. While some units had stockpiled food for winter operations, the scarcity of supplies was universal. Troops shared whatever they had, scavenged local resources, and improvised wherever possible. The struggle for nourishment became a quiet, constant part of life, shaping decisions, movements, and even morale in ways that commanders often struggled to measure or manage. Eating became a ritual of necessity rather than pleasure. Fires were built not for warmth alone, but to prepare whatever scraps could be consumed. Snow was melted into water, leather soaked to soften it for boiling, and even frozen roots or bark were chewed in desperation. Men sometimes traded or bartered supplies quietly, sharing morsels with comrades in silent acknowledgement of the shared ordeal. This solidarity offered small comfort, a reminder that, while hunger was universal, survival could still be a collective effort. The effects of starvation were both physical and mental. Muscles wasted from lack of nutrition, energy levels plummeted, and even small movements became exhausting. Concentration waned, making it harder to navigate, maintain watches, or respond quickly in combat. Anxiety and irritability increased. Sleep was restless, and the mind often wandered to memories of home, warm meals, and the simple act of eating with ease. Luxuries now impossibly distant. Winter intensified the challenge. Frozen supplies, snow-covered fields, and the constant need to keep moving to avoid frostbite made finding and consuming food a daily struggle. Soldiers' bodies demanded energy that was rarely available, creating a vicious cycle of weakness, cold, and hunger. Every day was a struggle for calories, every step a test of willpower, and every night a reminder that survival depended on ingenuity as much as courage. Even amid these horrors, moments of resilience emerged. Soldiers who shared the smallest portions, hunted together, or creatively prepared meager rations experienced fleeting victories that bolstered morale. Yet these were fragile triumphs, always shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same gnawing hunger, the same desperate search for sustenance in a frozen and unforgiving landscape. Starvation during Barbarossa was not simply a background hardship, it was a defining feature of life on the Eastern Front. It shaped decisions, dictated movements, and forced men to confront the limits of endurance in ways few could imagine. In the freezing silence of winter nights, the ache of empty stomachs became almost as terrifying as the sound of distant artillery. Constant reminder that survival was a daily grueling battle against the unforgiving reality of both war and nature. As the winter of 1941 deepened, the Eastern Front became a silent and unrelenting graveyard for countless soldiers. Death no longer arrived only with the roar of artillery or the flash of gunfire. It crept quietly through frostbite, disease, and exhaustion, claiming limbs, bodies, and spirits alike. Men who had survived marches, mud, and ambushes now faced an enemy as invisible as it was deadly. The merciless cold, frostbite became a quiet killer. Fingers, toes, and ears turned pale and numb, then blackened and swollen. Soldiers attempted to warm themselves by huddling together, thawing extremities over fires, or wrapping them in blankets, but the cold often prevailed. Those severely affected faced amputation or permanent disability if they survived at all. The pain, initially sharp, gave way to numbness, a terrifying quiet that masked the real danger until it was too late. Disease ran rampant in frozen camps and along the front lines. Respiratory infections, pneumonia, and fevers spread among soldiers huddled in wet, cramped tents or under snow-covered shelters. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses, fueled by starvation and poor hygiene, weakened the body further. Even minor wounds became life-threatening as frost, dirt, and bacteria combined to create infections that could not be treated properly in the field. Soldiers became shadows of their former selves, their strength sapped by the unceasing assault of cold, hunger, and illness. The deaths were often quiet and unceremonious. Men would simply not rise for the morning roll call, found stiffened by frost in their blankets, or curled in the snow where they had collapsed. Comrades who survived long enough to notice sometimes held makeshift vigils, covering the fallen with coats or branches, whispering prayers or memories of home. There were no honors, no fanfare, only the solemn acknowledgement that life had been snatched away in silence. The psychological weight of such deaths was immense. Soldiers watched friends, neighbors, and entire units succumb one by one, often too weak or overburdened to offer real aid. Fear became compounded with grief. Every movement through the snow and ice carried the possibility of seeing another body, another silent reminder of mortality. Sleep became both a refuge and a terror, for soldiers knew they might not awaken, or might awaken to find someone beside them gone. Exposure added to the quiet lethality. Freezing temperatures penetrated every layer of clothing, reaching bones and organs, weakening the immune system and sapping energy. Soldiers who fell asleep huddled against each other could still succumb to hypothermia in the early hours of the morning, their breaths shallow, their bodies stiffening in the snow. Even those who survived the night awoke exhausted, with frostbitten fingers and toes, aching muscles, and a growing sense of hopelessness. Amid these trials, comradeship became both a lifeline and a burden. Men shared what little warmth, clothing, or rations they could, helping each other survive another night. Yet each act of assistance was tinged with anxiety. For every friend kept alive, the specter of the next loss loomed. Soldiers learned to balance care for others with the stark realities of survival, knowing that even small miscalculations could lead to disaster. Death in silence was also marked by the eerie quiet of the winter battlefield. Artillery and gunfire seemed distant, softened by snow while the wind howled through empty fields and broken villages. The absence of sound emphasized the isolation of each soldier, making the sight of frozen comrades all the more poignant. A body lying stiff in the snow became a stark symbol of the fragility of life in the unforgiving environment. Even in the presence of death, life continued in fragile, tentative forms. Soldiers pressed forward despite frostbitten limbs, carried supplies for friends, or scavenged the remains of abandoned villages to survive another day. Each breath taken in the frigid air, each step through snow and ice, became a testament to endurance in the face of overwhelming loss. Yet the constant presence of death, quiet and impartial, served as a chilling reminder that survival was never guaranteed. By the end of each day, frozen camps held men huddled together, eyes weary, faces pale, listening to the sigh of wind and the distant crunch of footsteps over snow. The dead lay silently beside the living, a grim tableau of war's unrelenting toll. Every soldier understood that the winter front was as deadly as any battle, claiming life in silence and shaping the minds and hearts of those who endured. Survival had become not only a physical struggle but a quiet battle with grief, fear, and the ever-present shadow of death. In this world, Barbarossa was no longer simply a military operation. It had become an exercise in endurance, resilience, and the slow, relentless confrontation with mortality. Each man who woke to see the frost-filled sunrise was a survivor, bearing witness to the quiet carnage, understanding that the war's harshest adversary might not always be a gun, tank, or artillery shell, but the unyielding cold that claimed limbs, lives, and hope with silent efficiency. By late winter, the balance on the Eastern Front began to shift. The Red Army, battered yet resilient, launched a series of winter offensives that forced the weary German troops into a continuous, grueling retreat. Exhaustion, hunger, frostbite, and the psychological toll of prolonged hardship had already weakened the Wehrmacht, and now the pressure of coordinated Soviet attacks left them struggling to hold ground, forcing men into a slow, painful withdrawal. The first signs of this renewed Soviet vigor appeared in scattered counterattacks. Red Army units, accustomed to the harsh winter and partially better supplied for cold operations, struck with precision and timing that German forces were ill-prepared to counter. Infantry advanced through snow-covered fields with frozen weapons, supported by artillery that had been carefully positioned and camouflaged. Ambushes, once occasional and unpredictable, became a steady threat, leaving German columns vulnerable at every turn. Retreat, however, was far from orderly. Soldiers moved under constant threat, navigating frozen rivers, snow-draped forests, and broken terrain that had already sapped their strength. Vehicles became mired in ice and snow. Horses and draft animals, exhausted and hungry, struggled to pull wagons or artillery. Men carried supplies on their backs, trudging through drifts that reached knees or higher, while the sound of distant Soviet gunfire or artillery reminded them that every step was shadowed by danger. The march back was a test of endurance, a slow and relentless exercise in survival rather than strategy. Exhaustion was everywhere. Sleep remained fitful, often interrupted by alarm calls, the crunch of boots through snow or sudden attacks. Muscles already weakened by hunger and frostbite burned with effort. Blisters, chilblains, and untreated wounds worsened during the retreat, leaving men vulnerable to disease and infection. Each day's march, however short in distance, demanded more than it seemed possible to give, yet soldiers pressed on, aware that stopping could mean death. Morale plummeted under the combined weight of physical and psychological strain. Men who had once marched with confidence and purpose now questioned every order, every movement. Fear of encirclement or ambush lingered constantly, and the knowledge that comrades had fallen to frostbite, starvation, or bullets added to the sense of despair. Small skirmishes left men anxious and cautious, each minor victory tempered by the awareness that they could lose everything in a moment. The Soviet offensives were relentless in scope and execution. Infantry, supported by artillery and the occasional armored unit, pressed forward along multiple axes, forcing German troops into reactive maneuvers rather than coordinated countermeasures. Villages that had been captured with difficulty were often retaken or abandoned strategically, leaving soldiers to negotiate icy streets and frozen buildings while under fire. Communication lines, already tenuous, faltered under the stress of rapid Soviet movements, leaving commanders scrambling to relay orders and coordinate retreats. Hunger and exposure magnified the effect of the pushback. Men already weakened from months of cold, inadequate rations, and frostbite struggled to move quickly, leaving some to fall behind or succumb to exhaustion. Every retreating unit became a complex logistical puzzle. Wounded men needed assistance, supplies had to be salvaged or abandoned, and remaining food and fuel had to be distributed carefully to prevent disaster. Soldiers became acutely aware that survival depended not just on avoiding enemy fire, but on careful management of resources in conditions that offered no margin for error. The psychological impact of the Soviet pushback was profound. The dream of a swift, victorious campaign had long since faded, replaced by the grim recognition that the Eastern Front was now a war of attrition. Retreat meant more than losing ground. It meant abandoning positions, watching strategic gains slip away, and confronting the relentless reality of winter, hunger, and human endurance. For many soldiers, the humiliation of retreat compounded the physical suffering, reinforcing the sense that Barbarossa was a campaign that could neither be completed quickly nor received. Yet even in retreat, small acts of resilience persisted. Units coordinated rearguard actions to slow Soviet advances, soldiers shared food, warmth, and encouragement, and men adapted to the harsh conditions with grim determination. Every successful movement, every avoided ambush, and every saved comrade became a tiny victory in an otherwise punishing campaign. These acts, though modest, were vital to survival, reinforcing the bonds of camaraderie that sustained men even when morale faltered. By the end of each day, the retreating columns moved forward through snow-laden forests, frozen fields, and shattered villages, haunted by the sounds of distant gunfire, the sight of frozen comrades, and the constant pressure of the Red Army. The German advance of the summer was now a distant memory, replaced by a desperate struggle to survive, regroup, and maintain order in the face of relentless opposition. Operation Barbarossa, once the pinnacle of confidence and strategy, had become a living nightmare of retreat, endurance, and the unyielding power of winter combined with a determined enemy. The Soviet pushback marked the penultimate stage of the campaign's first year, a vivid demonstration that nature, combined with resilient opposition, could undo even the most confident military operations. For every exhausted soldier who survived the march, the realization lingered that the front was far from static, and survival depended on adaptability, vigilance, and sheer endurance. The nightmare of Barbarossa in its frozen, bloodied reality was far from over. As the first year of Operation Barbarossa drew to a close, the German campaign in the Soviet Union had ground to a painful halt. What had begun as a lightning advance, full of ambition and confidence, had transformed into a relentless ordeal of hunger, frost, disease, and the constant gnawing fear of death. For the soldiers who survived, reflection became a quiet, somber act, a way to reconcile the months of suffering with the fragile hope that they might endure another day. The memories of the campaign were vivid in the minds of every man who had marched, fought, and suffered across the frozen landscape. Soldiers remembered the early days of rapid advancement, the illusion of control and momentum, and the shock of realizing that the Soviet forces were neither broken nor defeated. The chaos of the first encounters, the dust and heat of summer marches, the smoke and fire of villages caught between armies, all remained etched in memory, now tinged with sorrow and fatigue. Winter had left its mark more profoundly than any battle. Frostbite, illness, and exhaustion had claimed countless lives quietly, leaving survivors to bear witness to death in its most silent form. Comrades frozen in the snow, bodies stiff in abandoned huts, faces pale and lifeless in the flickering light of small fires. These images haunted men long after the frost had loosened its grip. The cold, once a distant concept, had become an unyielding presence, shaping every movement, every thought, and every breath. Hunger was equally unforgettable. Soldiers recalled the desperation of boiled leather, frozen scraps, and scavenged vegetables, the endless search for food in villages stripped bare or fields buried beneath snow. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach had accompanied them through marches, fights, and nights spent huddled in thin blankets. Meals, when they came, were brief and cold, yet treasured as small victories in the midst of unrelenting scarcity. Starvation had taught patience, ingenuity, and the harsh limits of human endurance. Morale had been tested again and again. The chaos of battle, the unpredictability of ambushes, and the constant threat of Soviet counterattacks had left soldiers tense, wary, and on edge. Fear had become a constant companion, but it had also fostered a subtle camaraderie. Shared hardships, from frostbite to hunger to the terror of night patrols, created bonds that were as strong as any forged in triumph. Men learned to rely on each other not only for survival but for mental resilience, whispering encouragements, sharing warmth, and comforting the frightened or injured. As the German advance stalled and Soviet forces pressed forward, reflection deepened. Soldiers realized that the campaign's goal, rapid victory over the vast Soviet lands, had been a cruel illusion. The combination of harsh terrain, winter, logistical failures, and the enduring resistance of the Red Army had transformed Barbarossa into a grinding, punishing ordeal. Maps, orders, and plans seemed almost irrelevant in the face of ice, snow, and exhaustion. Survival had become the true measure of success. Despite the hardships, moments of human resilience persisted. Soldiers still lit fires to thaw frozen fingers, shared the last scraps of food, and aided each other through frozen forests and icy roads. Even in retreat, these acts of solidarity allowed men to maintain hope, however fragile, that life could continue, that one more day might bring warmth, nourishment, or even a step closer to safety. Endurance, rather than glory, became the central lesson of the campaign. Reflection also brought a quiet reckoning with loss. Friends, comrades, and entire units had vanished into frost, hunger, and disease. Each survivor carried the weight of memory. Faces, voices, and names of those who had fallen remained vivid, interwoven with the snow, mud, and silence of the Eastern Front. The human cost of Barbarossa was staggering, and it was etched not only in the statistics of battle, but in the minds and hearts of those who remained. As soldiers lay in the cold, huddled in tents, huts, or the open fields, sleep came slowly but inevitably. The mind replayed the horrors of the past months, the endless marches, the fear of ambushes, the gnawing hunger, the frostbite, and the deaths that had occurred quietly, without ceremony or fanfare. Yet in the stillness, a gentle calm emerged. The campaign had ended, and for those who survived, the mere act of breathing, resting, and enduring the night became a profound achievement. In this quiet reflection, Barbarossa became less a story of conquest and more a testament to human endurance in the face of unrelenting adversity. It was remembered not as a triumph, but as a living nightmare. Months of hunger, mud, cold, disease, and relentless struggle tempered only by the fleeting warmth of camaraderie, the shared resilience of soldiers, and the small victories of survival. For those who listened to the memories, in the soft hush of evening or the quiet hours of night, the lesson was clear. History is not only about battles won or lost, but about the human experience within them, the endurance, suffering, and quiet strength that defines survival even amid chaos. Operation Barbarossa remained a haunting chapter in the annals of war, remembered for its cruelty, its lessons, and the fortitude of those who faced its living nightmare. As the last embers of the fire faded, and the wind whispered through snow-covered fields, a gentle stillness settled over the weary soldiers. They closed their eyes, not in triumph, but in the deep, exhausted peace that comes from surviving yet another day. In the silent understanding that the hardest battles are often those against hunger, cold, fear, and the relentless passage of time.